My name's Leela, and I'm going to be bringing our reading to us. Our reading is from Mark chapter 8. We're starting at verse 11 to 30, and that can be found on page 1011 of the Bibles in front of you. Mark chapter 8, verses 11 to 30. The Pharisees came and began to question Jesus. To test him, they asked him for a sign from heaven. He sighed deeply and said, "Why does this generation ask for a sign? Truly I tell you, no sign will be given to it." Then he left them, got back into the boat, and crossed to the other side. The disciples had forgotten to bring bread, except for one loaf they had with them in the boat. "Be careful," Jesus warned them. "Watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod." They discussed this with one another and said, "It's because we have no bread." Aware of this discussion, Jesus asked them, "Why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not see or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes but fail to see, and ears but fail to hear? And don't you remember? When I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up?" 12, they replied. "And when I broke the 7 loaves for the 4,000, how many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up?" They answered, 7. He said to them, "Do you still not understand?" They came to Bethsaida, and some people brought a blind man and begged Jesus to touch him. He took the blind man by the hand and led him outside the village. When he had spat on the man's eyes and put his hands on him, Jesus asked, "Do you see anything?" He looked up and said, "I see people. They look like trees walking around." Once more, Jesus put his hands on the man's eyes. Then his eyes were opened, his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. Jesus sent him home, saying, "Don't even go into that village." Jesus and his disciples went on to the villages around Caesarea Philippi. On the way, he asked them, "Who do people say I am?" They replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others, one of the prophets." "But what about you?" he asked. "Who do you say I am?" Peter answered, "You are the Messiah." Jesus warned them not to tell anyone about him.
Thank you. My name's John, and I'm one of the ministers here. Going to spend some time looking at the verses from the Bible that Leda read to us a few minutes ago. So it would be great if you could open them up again in front of you. It's page 1011 in the church Bibles, and we're going to be working through those for a little while now. Hasn't it been good having the youth band leading us this evening? Guys, you sounded absolutely brilliant. Thank you. Can we say thank you? It's been really great. So to help us get into this passage, I want to put this up on the screen, and I wonder what you see. Okay, just quickly. If you see a duck, put your hand up. Okay, if you see a rabbit, put your hand up. Okay, and just put your hands down now. Look hard, and can you now see the other one? The duck and the rabbit? You see them both there? Yeah? Everybody? Hands up when you see them both? Okay, that's most of us. Great. Things are not always what they seem at first sight, are they? You look at it first, you think maybe it's a duck. You look at it again, you think maybe it's a rabbit. Sometimes our eyes play tricks on us, and we don't actually see things as they really are. I wonder if this face means anything to you. Harold Shipman. For many, many years, people saw Harold Shipman as a nice family GP who was looking after his patients and sorting out their sore throats and sending them off to hospital and all the things that nice family GPs do. But from the year 2000, it all changed. And people began to see Shipman in a completely different light when he was convicted of murdering 15 of his patients. Which was he? Family doctor or nasty, sadistic murderer? In fact, the investigations after he was imprisoned suggested he had killed up to 250 of his patients. Horrific. People are not always what they seem at first sight, are they? I'll give you a happier story on that for a moment. I've got a friend who I'll call Duncan. That's not actually his name, but he comes here on a Sunday morning. And Duncan's had a rough life. He's been in trouble with the law a few times. He struggles with alcohol. You could easily look on at him and completely misjudge him. But one time I was standing here in church, just to the back there, and a visitor came up to me and they said, "Look, I hope you don't mind me asking, but is that Duncan over there?" And I said, "Yes." "Why?" And they said, "Well, I used to work in a care home. I was the manager of a care home, and Duncan was on the staff. And you know, he was the best carer that we had there. If you ever had a family that was in trouble, maybe they were losing a relative or something, you sent Duncan in, and he was the one that would really care for them." Amazing, isn't it? I kind of learned from that sometimes you don't judge people. You just have to learn to see them in a different way. Well, the bit of the Bible that was just read to us is all about seeing, about the way we see things. And the big question that it's looking at is how do we see Jesus? How do we see Jesus? Do we really understand who he is, or have we already made up our minds about him and are missing who he really is? In fact, if you look at just 3 verses, I'm not going to look at it now, but verses 23 to 25, there are 9 different references to sight or seeing. And in the original language that the New Testament was written in, there are actually 8 different words there in those 9 references. So this whole thing is about seeing, sight, how we use our eyes. And the key question is, how do we see Jesus? And first of all, we're introduced to some people that are refusing to see who Jesus is. Their minds are closed. Their eyes are closed. They just won't see who he was. I remember, it's about 18 months ago now. It was a particular Sunday morning. And I was quite uptight about it because I was preaching and I had quite a lot of friends coming who weren't Christians. And what made it interesting was that the friends who were coming, well, part of it is they were coming to lunch afterwards. So whatever I said, I knew I would get into trouble for when I was having lunch with them. But the other thing was they were from several different religious backgrounds. There was one from a Christian background. There were several from a Hindu background, 1 or 2 from Muslim backgrounds as well. What made it even harder is I was speaking from a little bit in John's gospel where Jesus says, "I am the way, the truth, the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." Can you imagine how hard it is to speak on that verse when you've got friends there from lots of different religious backgrounds? Well, that was my situation on that Sunday morning. And we went back for lunch afterwards and we had really, really robust conversation. But you know, the interesting thing is some of those people have since become Christians. But some of them haven't. And the reason for the ones that haven't is this. Before they were even prepared to listen to what Jesus had to say, they just had to get over the problem of Jesus saying that no one comes to the Father except through me. And they weren't willing to get over that hurdle. And because they couldn't accept that, they actually weren't open to anything that Jesus had to say. Closed minds, refusing to see who Jesus is and what he came to do. And that's what we've got here at the beginning of the passage, because it happened in Jesus' time as well. And it especially happened with religious people. And in his case, it was with the strict religious leaders. We call them the Pharisees here, the strict religious leaders. And to them, Jesus was a threat, and they were determined not to see who he was. So verse 11, the Pharisees, these strict religious leaders, came and began to question Jesus. It was actually a bit more aggressive than that. They came to argue with Jesus. And to test him, they asked him for a sign, a miracle from heaven. They came to argue and to ask him to prove who he was. People that sometimes ask me, if God is there, why doesn't he do miracles, more miracles to show himself? And sometimes I say to them, okay, so if I pray for somebody and they get healed, you're saying you will believe, will you? And almost always they say, well, no, probably not, because they might have got better anyway, or there might be lots of other explanations. We could explain it away. That's often the reality. People are wanting miracles and signs, apparently, but even if they get them, it doesn't actually change anything. And that was the case for the Pharisees here. Jesus had done loads of miracles. There were lots of people around who could tell the Pharisees about the miracles that Jesus had done in their lives, but they were never satisfied. It was never enough. In reality, their minds were closed. And Jesus knew their minds were closed, and so he wasn't going to play their game. Verse 12, he sighed deeply. In the original language, it's really strong. It's stronger than that. It was kind of this got him deep down. He said. Why does this generation ask for a sign? Truly, I tell you, no sign will be given them. I'm not going to play your game. Your minds are closed. Do you know, you can be in church often and still have a closed mind about Jesus. Refusing to see who he is, or refusing to have your thinking about him challenged and stretched and enlarged. He's in the box that you've created for him. It might be the box of your worldview. You're convinced there's not a God, and therefore Jesus can't be the Son of God. And so you're convinced. You won't open your mind to that possibility. Or you've got him in the box of your traditional upbringing and expectations. That's who Jesus is. Very conservative, always on the side of caution, never pushing the boat out, and you won't listen to anything else. Or he's in the box of your radical political agenda. Jesus is just a kind of social reformer. You won't listen to anything else. He's in your box, and you're not willing to see him differently. Now, it seems to me, whether or not we're Christians here, if we're in that place where we're never willing for Jesus to surprise us and make us rethink who he is and what he came about, then our minds are closed. You'll never get Jesus taped up. There's always more to him than you expect. And it's not a good place to be, to have your minds closed. Because when minds are closed, we stop learning. Open your minds to who Jesus is so you can see. There's the first one, closed, refusing to see. And then second, we've got the disciples who were confused about Jesus. They were struggling to see. They wanted to know who he was, but they just couldn't quite get it clear in their heads. Here's another puzzle for you. Is it a 6 or is it a 9? It all depends which side you're looking at, doesn't it? And it probably depends who's influencing you as well, who's kind of pulling you over to their side. That was the problem for Jesus' disciples. They've been with him for a while now, and they've seen a lot of what he's done, but they're still confused about who he really is. They're struggling to see clearly. And if they listen to Jesus' closed-minded critics, the ones that we just heard about, then they're going to get even more confused. So what's going on? They've just been on the other side of the lake, and now they've crossed over in their boats. But there's a bit of a problem because there are like 13 or so of them on the boat, but they've only got one bit of bread between them, which isn't really enough for 13 people. Jesus is totally relaxed about only having one bit of bread between 13, because Jesus has a pretty good track record of feeding thousands of people from a couple of picnics. So it's not a problem for him. But the disciples seem quite uptight about it. And Jesus then says this thing which is just way too cryptic for the disciples. He says, verse 15, "Be careful, watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod." Yeast is something you make in bread. Yeast is something you use to make bread, yeah? And so the disciples think, yeast, bread, only one bit of bread, 13 people in the boat. Jesus must be saying something about the fact that we didn't bring enough bread with us. They're totally missing what he's saying. They're just not tuned in to the way he's speaking. Verse 16, they discussed this with one another and said, "Is it because we have no bread?" Aware of their discussion, Jesus asked them, "Why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not see or understand? Are your hearts hardened?" They're completely missing Jesus' points. What was his points? The yeast of the Pharisees, the yeast of Herod. Well, we've already met Herod and the Pharisees in the few chapters leading up to this. And the problem with both of them is, though they're a bit intrigued by Jesus, they're basically not open to him. They kind of think he's interesting, but they're not ready to have their minds changed about him. For Herod, what really matters is looking good in front of other people. We saw that a couple of weeks ago. For the Pharisees, what really matters is their tradition, what they're used to. And so both of them say, "Give us miracles and signs and then we'll believe you," as a kind of defense so that they don't have to take Jesus seriously. By the way, those are quite big issues, aren't they? Don't want to take Jesus seriously because I'm afraid of what people will think about me, or because I don't want to have my prejudices challenged. I wonder if that works for some of us here this evening. Actually, we've really got closed minds because we don't want to face what Jesus says, because if we do, we may be going to lose some friends about it. Or we're going to have our worlds turned upside down by it, and we quite like the way life is, thank you. Jesus is saying, be very careful of that attitude. When it comes to thinking about who Jesus is, it's too important to close your minds over those kinds of things. It doesn't really matter what people think about us. It doesn't really matter if Jesus is going to turn your life upside down. If he is who he said he is, that's what matters. But the Pharisees and Herod say, no, that isn't what matters. What matters is looking cool. What matters is keeping my world the way that I like it, thank you. Jesus says, careful. That's like yeast. Once, you only need a little bit of yeast and it fills up the whole dough that you're making, I think. And Jesus is saying, you let that attitude get into your heart and you're never really going to see who Jesus is. Just worry all the time about what people think about you and you're never going to have your mind open to Jesus. Just try and preserve life the way you like it and Jesus is going to be far too radical for you. Watch out for the yeast, he says, of the Pharisees and Herod. Make sure your minds are really open. Otherwise, you're just going to get more and more confused. And so he then kind of takes them through a little bit of evidence. Why are they going on about the bread? Why are they missing the point? He says, verse 18, do you have eyes but fail to see? Back to seeing again, and ears but fail to hear. And don't you remember when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up? 12, they replied. Okay, couple of picnics, 5,000 people fed, full, 12 baskets left. There's quite a lot of bread left, quite a lot more than they had at the beginning. Okay, beginning to get it. And when I broke 7 loaves for the 4,000, how many basketfuls did you pick up? They answered, 7. And Jesus said to them, do you still not understand? Do you still think I'm making a point about only having 1 bit of bread between 13 when I could feed all those thousands of people from a couple of picnics? You're just not getting it. You're missing the point. We saw last week how the Jewish people, and the disciples, remember, were Jewish people. They knew from their scriptures, what we call the Old Testament, that the Messiah, that is their promised king and rescuer that they were expecting, he would prepare this massive meal for them, this great feast. They called it a banquet. And by feeding those 5,000, Jesus was showing he really was the Messiah who was coming. He was the one that all of their history had been looking forward to. But then when he fed the 4,000, they weren't Jewish people, they were non-Jews. We call them Gentiles. And so Jesus was showing that he hadn't only come for the Jewish people, he'd come for the whole world as well. He was the rescuer, the king for everybody from all the nations. He was huge. But the disciples weren't seeing that. No, they were just confused, worrying about bread. And they were in danger of being influenced by Herod and the Pharisees, whose minds were just closed against Jesus. He's saying, don't stay in that place of confusion. Keep your mind open. See, some of us are probably in that place of confusion as well. We look at Jesus, we hear stuff about him, we come to church maybe, we hear all this stuff, but we're really still not sure. And there are people all around us in our society telling us not to take Jesus seriously. Here are a couple of them. Physicist Stephen Hawking, heaven is just a fairy story for those who are afraid of the dark. Friends, that isn't an argument. It's just an insult, isn't it, to be honest? But it's the kind of stuff we're hearing all the time, and it has that drip feed effect on us that makes us want to dismiss who Jesus is. Richard Dawkins, another one. Accounts of Jesus' resurrection and ascension are about as well documented as Jack and the Beanstalk. That isn't an argument. It's just an insult. There's lots of evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. But Jack and the Beanstalk is a story somebody made up. It's not an argument, but it influences us. And it adds to our confusion. Jesus is saying to his disciples, look, be careful of all the stuff that is making you not take me seriously. Instead, look at the evidence. Remember the bread, the fishes, the crowd, the miracles, the baskets of food left over. Remember, see, look at the evidence, see, so that you can really see who Jesus is. It's still the same today. We're invited to look at the evidence, to read through Mark's gospel. Lots of evidence there from the first century. Or go on the Alpha course where you can have all the evidence out in front of you and you can talk back and ask your questions. Look at the evidence. Don't stay in that place of confusion. Closed to who Jesus is, refusing to see, confused about who Jesus is, struggling to see, but then something completely different. A person is healed so that they are able to see. Just imagine if that is how the world looked to you. Can we just have the lights a bit lower for a moment, just so we can all see that? Okay? Just imagine if that was how the world looked to you. It's all blurred. You really can't see much of what's going on. And then suddenly, this happens. And you can see everything clearly. Nice picture, isn't it? One of my favorite places, Grasmere in the Lake District. Okay, we'll have the lights back up now. That's pretty much what happened to a guy in this little place called Bethsaida. Did you notice the lovely way that Leela said Bethsaida earlier? It was brilliant, Bethsaida. I thought, there's some cider in Bethsaida. I'm sure that's a better way of saying it, but thank you. But that's what happened to this guy in Bethsaida when Jesus showed up. But the way it happened was a little bit strange. So Jesus takes this blind man outside of the village and spits on his eyes, it's a little bit unusual, and then puts his hands on them, and the man can kind of start to see, but it's all a little bit blurred. It's a little bit like that picture. He can't really see clearly. He says, I can see, but people are like trees walking. I can't really see. And so Jesus goes back to him, verse 25. Once more, Jesus put his hands on the man's eyes, and then his eyes were opened, his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. Everything clearly. And that's very much what it's like for the disciples in terms of how they see Jesus. They are slowly, bit by bit, seeing who he really is. It's slow, it's a journey. It's not just a one-off hit, boom, and now they've seen. It's more like a slowly dawning reality as the fog begins to clear and they begin to see who Jesus is. And eventually, they will see everything clearly. Because just as Jesus opened the eyes of the blind man step by step, so he's opening their eyes bit by bit to see. And you know, I think that's such good news. Such good news for some of us here who we're on a journey when it comes to Jesus, but the bits haven't quite fallen into place for us yet. Maybe you come to church, maybe you've done Alpha, or maybe you haven't. Maybe you like what you see in the lives of Christians around you, but you know you're not quite there yet. You're still not really clear who Jesus is and whether it matters. Well, this is a great place for you just to find a bit of encouragement. It's okay. If you keep looking And I mean seriously looking. I don't just mean kind of pretending to look. I mean seriously looking. If you keep looking, you will see. You will find. Because Jesus is in the business of helping people see. But don't just settle for blurred vision. Because that's a big danger. There's something quite kind of cozy about saying, oh, I'm a bit confused about Jesus. It's a bit non-committal, isn't it? You know, you're never going to get into any trouble at school or college if you say, well, I'm a bit interested in Jesus, but I'm a bit confused about Jesus. And you won't get into too much trouble at church either, because people will think, well, at least you're kind of talking about him. It's an easy place to be. I'm still a bit blurred about Jesus, but it isn't a good place to stay. Did you see the intensity with which this blind man wanted his sight back? Verse 20, they came to Bethsaida, and some people brought a blind man, and he begged Jesus to touch him. He begged Jesus to touch him. He longed for sight. He wanted to see. And I want to say to you, Jesus is too important to mess around with. If he is who he said he is, it changes everything. And if he isn't, we need to walk away fast. But just staying with blurred vision, confused about him, it's not a good place to be. We need to keep looking. We need to beg him for sight until we understand who he really is. Beg him to touch you. Beg him to give you that sight. Keep reading the Bible. Keep looking at the evidence. Keep asking your questions to Christians you know. And if you're serious, he'll help you see clearly as well. And that's what happens to Simon Peter in the final section, where finally he is convinced about who Jesus is. He's beginning to see. Verse 27, Jesus brings everything out into the open. He says to his disciples on the road to villages around Caesarea Philippi, he says, who do people say that I am? That's the big question. Who's everybody saying that I am? Who is Jesus? And they respond, verse 28, some say John the Baptist, Jesus' cousin. Others say Elijah, one of the big prophets in the Old Testament. Still others say one of the prophets, perhaps one of the other prophets from the Old Testament. But then comes the key question as Jesus just eyeballs them and says, but what about you? What about you? Who do you say that I am? Who do you say that I am? It is the most important question any of us will ever ask. Think of all the questions that you're going to have to answer on exam papers, those of you that are still at school or college or university. Lots of questions. Think of all the questions you have to ask and answer as you go through life. Lots of questions, life's full of questions, but this is the most important question you will ever answer. Jesus eyeballs them, but Jesus also eyeballs you this evening. And he says, who do you say that I am? And at last, Peter sees what all the evidence has been pointing to. Verse 29, what about you? Who do you say I am? Peter answered, you are the Messiah. That is to say, you are the one God promised to send, who will rescue us, who will bring us back to God. You are Jesus, the center of history. You're the one we've been waiting for. You're the one on whom all our hope is pinned. You are the Messiah. Now, the truth is that Peter's seeing was still not all that clear. He had all kinds of misunderstandings about what it would mean for Jesus to be the Messiah. But over time, Jesus would straighten all those out as well, and the vision would become clearer and clearer. Peter would come to see that because Jesus was the Messiah, he would end up stretched out on a Roman cross and smashed to death and crucified. Not for anything he'd done, but because he was paying the price for all the mess in our lives, all the mistakes that we've made. And Peter would come to see that having been crucified, the Messiah would rise from death to life that would go on forever, eternal life. And that because Jesus has paid for our sins on the cross, we don't have to. We can walk free from them. And that because he has smashed the power of death and broken open the way to life in his resurrection, we too can have eternal life. All that and so much more in the end Peter would come to understand was involved with Jesus being the Messiah. But for now, we'll just stay with this one moment where Peter, for the first time, began to see clearly. "What about you?" Jesus said. "Who do you say I am?" And Peter said, "You are the Messiah." He'd come to see who Jesus really was. And you know, the whole course of his life would change because of that moment. He was going to go from becoming a family fisherman on a little lake in the north of Israel to a man who would end up giving everything to tell the world the good news of who Jesus is and how he can set us free. His life was totally turned around by facing the reality of who Jesus is. But it all came back to that question on the dusty road to the villages around Caesarea Philippi. As Jesus looked him in the eye and said, "Never mind everybody else. Who do you say that I am? Who do you say?" Last Sunday morning, Adam Connor Smith was baptized here. Maybe some of you were here and saw it. Adam is a physiotherapist, and Adam had for a long time been a very determined atheist. But Adam had a run of patients who were Christians, and while he was doing the nasty things that physios do to people, these Christians said to him, "You really ought to look into Jesus." Sorry, physios are good, really, don't get me wrong. And one day, Tony, who's at the back there from the church here, had a bad back, I think it was, and went to see Adam and said, "Well, why don't you come to church?" And you know, the next Sunday, I think it was, or soon after, Adam came to church. And he brought all his family with him as well. I still remember in the top hall at the back there, meeting him after his first service here at Above Bar. He was intrigued and unconvinced, and so he signed up for Alpha. He had the courage to open his mind and look at the evidence. And he went to Alpha determined to prove that the whole thing was a load of rubbish. He said so. But then I remember talking to him in the lounge there over coffee a couple of months later. And I was amazed when Adam said to me, "Do you know, I am now pretty much convinced that the evidence shows that Jesus really was the Son of God." Amazing. And Adam, soon after, became a Christian. And his wife has since become a Christian. And last week, in front of his whole family, most of whom are not Christians, and many of his friends, he told us all that Jesus had changed his life and that he, Adam, was pleased to be following him. And now he's busy telling lots of other people the good news as well. Jesus is still in the business of helping people see. He helped Adam see. He can help you see. And when they do see, it's amazing. It changes everything about their lives. Jesus can help you see. And he can change your life like he changed Peter's and like he changed Adam's. But if that's going to happen, you've got to hear him as he eyeballs you this evening. And he asks you that question. Forget everybody else. Who do you say that I am? Have you got the courage to get off the fence, make up your mind, and decide? Who do you say that I am? Are you going to dare to face that question? Everything hangs on it. Life changes when we answer that. If you are willing to face the question, what is your answer? Who is this Jesus? If, as Peter realized, and Adam has since discovered, if he really is the Messiah, the Son of God, as I believe he is, I want to ask you, will you this evening give your life and follow him? Just maybe for someone here this evening, or a few people, that time has come where it's no longer about what everybody else says and all the stuff you're told to believe. It's your turn to say, I've got to answer the question. Who is Jesus really? What do I say? Am I willing to stake my life on the answer to that question and get up out of my seat and choose to follow him? You made that decision? I'm going to ask us all just to bow our heads as the band come forward and just give us a moment to respond to that. Who do you say that I am? Jesus is asking that question. He's not asking it of the person next to you. He's asking you. Who do you say that I am? And if this evening, for the first time, you want to say, do you know, Jesus, I've been faffing around with this for a long time, but tonight I want to make my mind up. And I want to ask you just to pray this simple prayer after me. And then maybe come and find me at the end, and I'd love to give you a booklet just to help you on your way. So if you want to say yes to Jesus this evening, please pray silently with me. Lord Jesus, I believe you are the Son of God. I believe that you came to pay the price for everything wrong in my life by dying on the cross. I want to turn now from living my own way and turn to follow you and live your way. Please forgive me for all my mistakes. Come into my life, be in charge, fill me with your Spirit. I choose to be your disciple. Amen.